in the next 20 to 25 minutes, going to take you through the South African experience of the Child Support Grant. I'm going to look at the historical context, basically go way back to 1998 when the Child Support Grant was developed, and look at some of the history and the design elements and thought processes that went into that, and then bring us up to date with current practices. I'm going to look a bit at the impacts of the Child Support Grant. If I have time, I'd like to touch on the topic of conditionality, but we might not have time in the presentation, although there are slides for those who are interested to look at that. And also, depending on time, there are some myths around cash transfers that I'd like to delve into, but we might not have time for that. And then lastly, I'll close by just sharing some of the future thoughts around the Child Support Grant. So maybe just to give a pretext to everything, in South Africa, social security is a right, including social assistance, however, subject to progressive realization within a reasonable and justifiable manner. But when our Child Support Grant was formulated, it was more or less formulated at the same time as what our Constitution was formulated. So it's quite interesting how the two align. Just a brief little advert for those that really want to know about this design. This book, written by the head of the Land Committee, who chaired the design, the development of the policy of the Child Support Grant. She wrote a very interesting book, but it's not an academic book like most papers that one would read. So it really shares the experiences both from civil society, both from government, but also from the various experts and so forth. And it gives a real feeling of how policy actually, how it comes about within government. And I'll be sharing snippets from this book, but obviously there's a lot more depth if for those that are interested. But just to give a bit of context, as many of you may know, South Africa comes from before 1994, we were racially divided in a regime, what we call the apartheid regime. In 1994 to 1997 was a transition period for us, where we had two big issues to deal with. One was the race issue, and one was the equity issue. It was a bit easier dealing with the race issue. We could just change all legislation that had racial discrimination in, but that race issue had obvious impacts on equity, and up to today we still have immense challenges of dealing with the equity issue. Now, before 1994, we had a system of social grants, and most of those grants were rolled out to all races. The old age grant, the disability grant, because those numbers weren't very high, because we have a very young population, the previous government was able to roll those grants out to all races. However, because we have a young population, we had a huge number of children. So the previous child grant that we had was called the State Maintenance Grant, and it was not possible to roll this out. So in 1994, the government had the dilemma that it was spending about 1.2 billion rand on the State Maintenance Grant. And if they were to roll it out to all races, it would cost about 12 billion rand. And coming out of the previous regime, our economy wasn't doing very well. There was just no way we could afford 12 billion rand, which is a tenfold increase on the current budget, and hence there was a need for reform. So a committee of inquiry was set up. It was headed by an academic head, a few members from civil society, and a couple of experts, including some government members. And they were tasked to explore different options around looking or replacing this child maintenance grant. And they looked at a number of options, such as, for example, reforming the private parental maintenance system, in other words, making fathers support their children. Not necessarily a feasible idea given how the apartheid system broke up families, especially African families, during that time. They also looked at increasing support for traditional social welfare services, that's your social work services. There was this emergent idea about developmental social welfare services. Alternatives such as nutrition programs were looked at, or just basically supplementing ECD programs. And they looked at a whole range of that, but eventually settled on that they should preferably, or they recommended that they should continue with the cash transfer. However, they just had to modify the existing cash transfer. So, and the reasons for this was that there was already a huge body of evidence in South Africa demonstrating the effectiveness of the cash transfers. So as I mentioned before, other grants, for example, like the old age grant, was rolled out to all communities prior to 1994. And a lot of research was done that showed that households that had an older person in and got the old age grant, the development of those children was much higher than in households that didn't have an older person in and wasn't in receipt of an old age grant. So there was a lot of evidence already suggesting that cash transfers for children would be very effective. For us, we were fortunate in that it would be easy to go to scale because we already paid the old age grant and the disability grant. In most communities, this would basically just piggyback on that existing infrastructure. So the infrastructure was there, and the Treasury also saw it as a shorter route between the Treasury and the pockets of the poor. And as I mentioned, the precedent already existed for cash transfer. So it was easy for the committee to motivate for a new cash transfer. So the main thing was then the design issues. Now, while these are mainly technical design questions, it was also realized that these are very deeply political questions because ultimately the design of your grant influences who's going to get the grant and who's not going to get the grant. And as I mentioned, one of the main drivers at the time was the shortfall of budget. They only had that 1 billion rand to 1.2 billion rand space to work with. So they had to design the grant in such a way that they were only going to reach a certain number of children at the onset, and they had to basically make a few trade-offs. So again, from an academic perspective, they had to wrestle with a lot of issues around universalization versus targeting, eligibility issues, levels of the benefit, and so forth. So they tried to approach it from a scientific basis. They looked at the household and subsistence level for food and clothing for very young children or children under 6 years old. And back then it was at 70 rands. So, and then they also looked at age of eligibility. And much of the research around ECD at the time suggested that the 0 to 9 years was so the main years for early childhood development. So the committee's initial proposal was to provide a benefit according to their modeling of roughly 75 rands for children between the ages of 0 and 9. Now, the previous state maintenance grant had both a caregiver grant as well, a caregiver portion of the grant as well as a child portion. And the child portion of the grant was about 125 rand. So there was this huge uproar from civil society and a huge pressure and lobby against government when they suggested that they're going to implement this grant at 75 rands, which was a cut from the 125 rands. And that eventually pressured government to implement it at 100 rands, but obviously not having the fiscal space available at the time, government then had to cut the age of eligibility from 9-year-olds to 7-year-old, and the child support grant was then initially implemented at 100 rand per month for children between the ages of 0 and 7. Another key aspect of the policy was moving away from the traditionally defined household structures. So that the committee realized that because of the effects of apartheid, because of forced migration and so forth, many African households have pretty much disintegrated. You had children living not with their biological parents, but with their grannies or sometimes the aunts and uncles, or even sometimes with strangers. And they realized that if they had to pay the grants to the biological parent, you would have large portions of society excluded from the grant, and hence they came up with the concept of the primary caregiver based on the principle that the grant should follow the child. Means testing was also a very difficult issue for them to deal with, realizing that if they put a complicated means testing in place, a lot of people were going to be excluded, and the aim really at the time, the policy aim was to try and include as many people as possible in poor households. So basically they opted for a very simple means test, one in which the primary caregiver simply had to declare their income, and if it was below a certain level, they would be able to get the grant. Now, one of the big issues, as Alejandro mentioned, South Africa is generally regarded as not having conditions on the child support grant. However, that's not entirely true. It's always something that we've been grappling with right since the beginning. We might not be conditions as traditionally perceived by many, say, Latin American countries, but there's always been this notion that our social grant program needs to be linked to our other programs such as education and health. And at the beginning, the committee really grappled with the issue, but realizing, because we were still in a very young stage of our development, many of our health programs, many of our education programs were also still in the process of being rolled out to all communities. At that stage, it didn't seem feasible to link any of these programs, because that would hamper, the one program's development would be hampered by the other program's development. And as mentioned earlier, the cash transfer program we could run with very fast because we already had the infrastructure and everything in place. So the decision was then that it's a good idea, it's something we should consider in the future, but not necessarily implement with immediate effect. Now, one of the interesting things that happened, so the committee designed this new grant and made this proposal to government for something that was meant to be very simple, very accessible, but on implementation it became very complex. Application procedures became very, very complex. What should have been a very simple grant to apply for, you eventually, when implemented by the state bureaucrats, you needed more papers and more documents than any of the other grants to apply for them. However, over time, over the last 15 years or so, we've began to, return to that original policy intent and moved away from a lot of the bureaucracy around providing this grant. And again, this is, I think, one of the key points I want to make here is that in South Africa we have a very strong civil society, and to a large extent they have lobbied and pressured government to even during the formulation of the grant, the policy for the grant, but also in the implementation of the grant, they've played a very important role, I think, to shape the way the grant was designed and eventually implemented. And the next few slides, not that I want to go through each of them, but this is just a few examples of a lot of the case law in South Africa on the grants, some of these constitutional cases which eventually shape the way grants are delivered. The only one, I think one of the important ones that I do want to mention was the Mashava case, which eventually got our social grants. When it was implemented, it was provided at local level, but what eventually happened, different provinces were paying different grants using different administration systems. Some were paying, some others would skip months and so forth, and we had a lot of province differences across the provinces. And eventually we had a constitutional case that declared this function a national function, and that lifted the function to the national level and ultimately to the formation of the South African Social Security Agency. So while the agency was established in 2006, it was really just a consolidation of all the functions that were in the provinces already. Okay, the next slide basically just shows how the child support grant has increased both horizontally and vertically over the last couple of years. Our biggest challenge still remains in the 0 to 1 cohort, although in the last few years with the support of UNICEF and some work we've been doing with them, we have managed to get the numbers in the 0 to 1 quite substantially, although this still does remain a challenge for us. This graph basically just shows you my apologies for not having a header there, but basically just shows you the financing of our child support grant, which is the green line. As you can see, starting very low and growing to about 1.25% of GDP. In the early years, it was the costs were offset by a declining cost in the provision of some of our other grants, such as the old age and disability grants. And fortunately, from there onwards, we had relatively good economic growth, and we see the grants, total grants, growing from about 2.5 to 3% of GDP. I'm going to skip our beneficiary profile just to give you a sense of our grant value. The child support grant in last year was at 315 rands, which is about 53 PPP dollars, which is about 40% of the median per capita income in our country. This slide basically just shows you the value of the child support grant to poor households. In the bottom 2 to 3 deciles, the child support grant makes up a very large percentage of household income, and is often, in many of these households, it's often the main source of regular, stable income. In terms of impacts on poverty and inequality, I'm going to skip the 2 slides that basically just show how other countries use their social transfers. As you can see, many countries have very high levels of inequality, but they effectively use their social transfers and progressive tax systems to reduce their levels of inequality. Similarly, even in developed countries, you'll see high levels of poverty, which is effectively reduced with transfers and progressive tax systems. This is the South African case. So in our primary distribution, one sees that on these growth incidence curves that during the period 1995 to 2005, it's a period where we had quite moderate growth. We see that the top 10% of our population, we see income growth of about 10% in real terms, whereas the bottom 40% of our population actually have negative growth in real terms. And then the graph on the right shows when we add the social grants to this, we see that stabilizes to some extent at about 4% for the bottom 70% of the population. So in other words, if we didn't have our social grants in place, we would have had quite negative, or we'd have quite a bad growth incidence curve, negatively impacting the bottom 70% of the population, one would say. And social grants therefore play a very important role in stabilizing incomes amongst our lower income earners. Just a income distribution graph. I think it's very similar to other unequal countries. You get 50% of income going to the top 10% and 10% going to the bottom 50%. This graph basically shows how social grants move some of that income to the bottom quintiles. Unfortunately, in South Africa, inequality has worsened over the last 2 decades. However, the social grants, if one just looks at the green line to the blue line, does significantly reduce inequality, at least to our sort of 1995 levels. This graph basically uses a Lorenz type curve to show that social grants, which is the red line, is a very pro-poor program relative to many of our other programs which are quite neutral, or higher education, which is a bit unequally distributed currently in our country. In terms of other impacts, the department conducted an impact evaluation study released in 2012. CSG, so from the qualitative research, we see that CSG is used primarily for food, and however, that it's not specifically used for the child, but it's a grant that goes into the household and pretty much gets used for the consumption needs of the entire household. We also see that the households do value services such as ECD and health quite a lot. From the quantitative side, we also see that the top 5 reported uses of the grant are food, education, clothing, household durabilities, health, and transportation. And we see that the grant does have impacts in terms of grade attainment, mathematical and reading test scores, and also significantly having positive effects for girl children. And this is not unlike many other countries where similar results in terms of consumption is seen. In terms of nutrition, one sees, or in terms of hunger, one sees that as the social grants for children have increased over the years as we rolled out, and I think I missed that slide that showed that we eventually rolled the child support grant out from 7 to 9 to 14 to 15 and then eventually 18. By 2012, we've reached all children up to the age of 18. And as one can see that as that increases, we're also seeing a similar decrease in reported hunger during that period. So a nice inverse correlation there between those two. In terms of schooling, we see that children who are enrolled in the child support grant at birth completed a statistically significant number of grades of schooling, more schooling compared to those who have enrolled at the age of 6. And similarly, on arithmetic scores, we see a 6% increase. And the interesting part about this as well is that when we look at, sorry, that's the next slide. Sorry, and also in terms of girl children, we see early receipt of the CSG reduces delayed school entry of girls by 26%, 26.5%, and girls who have enrolled early obtain higher marks and in mathematics and reading tests. For children whose mothers have less than 8 grades of schooling, we see that early enrollment raises grade attainment by 0.38 grades, which is about a 10% increase. And this suggests that CSG is playing a compensatory role for caregivers with low levels of schooling. In terms of absence from school, we see that males in households receiving the CSG were absent approximately 7 days fewer than than males in households not receiving the CSG. And in terms of health, we see children enrolled in early life are less likely to have experienced illness. And amongst boys, we see that early enrollment in the CSG has a lower predicted likelihood of being ill, 21% compared to 30%. And another very interesting study from our CSG study was the role CSG played and how that correlates to work outside of home and how that correlates to adolescents' risky behavior. So we see that adolescents receiving the CSG are less likely to be exposed to early sex, less likely to be involved in gang activity, criminal activity, or to have consumed drugs or alcohol. The research on labor market participation is a little bit, it's not conclusive at the moment, but if anything, it does show that the grants do have a positive impact rather than a negative impact on labor market participation. So while the differences are small, one does find that those households that are receiving the CSG, that the members of those households, not just the caregiver, but the other members in those households, are less likely to be out of the labor force and more likely to be searching for employment. All right, I'm not going to have time to speak to the conditionalities, and maybe I must just say that this is something South Africa has been grappling with over the last the last 2 decades. It's still something we're looking at. From us, though, it's very much from a social assistance, from a rights-based. So social assistance is a right, education is a right, health is a right, gender is a right. And so one of the things we must ensure is that none of these rights are compromised by trying to implement the other one. And for us, it's more about trying to find the linkages and the synergies between these programs. So in our current legislation, we have an attempt to say that if it's reported that a child is not in school, the Director General of the department needs to appoint a social worker to basically go out and help that family and help them to get the child back in school. Our implementation is we've not had one single reported case, so but we acknowledge that we're not yet there. We're still struggling with that, and it's difficult to implement something like that. We're looking at trying to link our databases with education. When we did the preliminary link, we just found out that our databases aren't very clean, and so we had to do a lot of cleanup, and we're still busy with that process. In terms of education as well, most of our CSG beneficiaries are in school. 97% of them are in school. Similarly with health, the bulk of our young children are vaccinated. Final slide, basically just to conclude with, looking forward, coverage of the CSG is important. As mentioned, as I showed earlier on, the 0 to 1 category, we're not getting optimal levels of coverage there, and we need to continue driving access in that area. We're also looking at expanding or increasing the value of the CSG, noting that it's very, very small. And one group of children, vulnerable children, orphans, and child-headed households, we're looking at implementing just a slightly higher value of the CSG for them. We also very strong debate in society now is the universalization of the child support grant and extending the child support grant to ages beyond 18 for children that remain in education and training. And we're also looking at developing pregnancy and maternity support benefits. And that brings me to the end. I'm going to hand over back to Alejandro.
Many thanks, Brenton. Many thanks, Brenton. A very rich and comprehensive presentation, and you managed to make it within the prescribed time. So I'm very thankful to you for it. Just a few highlights which I find of a special interest, starting with the fact that there is a constitutional provision that entitles everyone to appropriate social assistance, and that provides a very strong normative framework and defines access or the realization of such right as an entitlement, not simply as a gift. And that normative framework is also buttressed by a number of pieces of legislation, most importantly the Social Assistance Act of 2004, which defines eligibility to social assistance, the types of social grants, their administration, and so on and so forth. You mentioned the very strong push from government from the beginning to expand coverage of social assistance, and also the fact that South Africa perhaps is unique compared to many other countries in the fact that it has a very strong civil society, which has also pushed and sometimes on occasions not shied away from even taking the government to court, and that has resulted in a body of case law which you briefly touched upon. There was, I think that there was a lot of learning also along the way and experimentation, a number of both policy and changes to policy and changes to implementation. You mentioned, of course, the extension of age eligibility from the initial eligibility of up to 7 years old. There was a staggered extension of the age of eligibility, so that now children under the age of 18 are eligible, qualify for the grant. But this was also coupled with systematic increases in the means test thresholds and in benefit levels, and all combined, the expansion of coverage with the increases in benefit levels and the increase in the means test thresholds show in some of the findings that you shared in terms of the impacts, for example, on poverty and on the distribution of income. There are a number of questions that it would be a good idea to elaborate later on, especially on the way forward, and maybe also something on the some idea on the costs of the program and how it is financed, and some overall trends in financing for the CSG over the years. But now let me turn to our discussant to give additional insights into this session. We have a discussant who's been studying the experience of with child allowance programs in a number of Latin American countries. Generally speaking, though this is a broad sort of a broad generalization, the Latin American model, if one can speak about a model, differs in some important ways from what South Africa has done. But even within Latin America, there have been important differences across countries, especially between the programs with the greatest longevity, such as in Mexico, Brazil, or Colombia, and programs in the southern cone countries of Latin America, like Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay. So let me give the floor to our discussant. Roxana Mauricio is an associate professor in economics at Universidad Nacional de General Sarmiento in Buenos Aires, Argentina. Roxana holds a master's degree in political economy from the Universidad Nacional de Buenos Aires and a PhD in economics from the Universidad Nacional de La Plata. She has held research and consultancy positions for national and international organizations such as the ILO, UNDP, the Economic Commission for Latin America, the Caribbean, UNICEF, and the World Bank. Her main areas of expertise include child-focused social protection programs, labor economics, income distribution, employment and social policies, poverty, and the macroeconomics of employment and income. Roxana will speak for about 10 to 15 minutes. And in the meantime, I would like to invite members of the audience to submit questions online so that we can collect them and engage in a Q&A at the end of Roxana's presentation. So let me turn over the floor to you, Roxana. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Let me see. Okay, thank you so much, Alejandro. Thanks a lot, Brenton, for your excellent presentation and very comprehensive presentation about the South Africans and child support and grant. I think that your presentation is very interesting in order, for instance, to compare the South African case with the Latin American cases. So the idea of this very few minutes is try to compare the main aspect of the South African case with some Latin American cash transfers programs. As already mentioned by Alejandro, there are a lot of common points between these experiences, but at the same time there are important differences between them. So I would like to try to compare the main aspect of some aspect of these and different experiences in order to draw lessons or to draw conclusions, especially about the future of these cash transfers, not only in South Africa but also in Latin America. So let me start with a very, very brief overview of some Latin American experiences regarding cash transfers, in order to then to discuss about two important aspects. In my opinion, there are two important debates regarding these cash transfers. The first one is regarding the debate between universal versus targeted approach regarding these cash transfers, and the second one is the conditional versus unconditional cash transfers, because this is a very big difference between the South African experience, the South African case, and the most Latin American cases. So let me start with presenting the main aspect of the Latin American experience, and I would like to say that the origin of these cash transfers was associated with the fact that the incidence of poverty in children and adolescents compared to other age groups was and is higher. So considering this aspect, the higher incidence of child poverty in comparison with the rest of the age groups, as from the mid-90s, Latin American countries have been implementing and expanding conditional cash transfers to families with children. This expansion was very important in all these countries because represented an important step forward in the field of social protection in Latin America. Nowadays, almost all countries have some sort of these CCT programs, and they have gradually become an important mechanism within social policies and regional poverty reduction strategies. For instance, nowadays the coverage in Argentina is high, around 80% of children are covered by some pillars of child social protection, and in Brazil also this coverage is high. These CCTs are in general means-tested programs, as in the case of South Africa, but in this case I would like to say that this is not exactly the case of Argentina, because the Universal Child Allowance implemented in 2009 in Argentina is a non-contributory benefit, but is not associated directly with the family incomes, but instead is an extension of the already existing contributory family allowances to children. This extension is to reach workers in the informal economy and those people unemployed or inactive. So in fact, this is an extension of the family allowances for formal sector to the informal sector, and an extension for unemployed children in unemployed families. They include conditionality, as in the case of South Africans. These conditionalities are related to certain nutrition, education, medical checkups, and particular, of course, for children and adolescents. But beyond this in general overview of this cash transfer, this common point across Latin American countries, we can observe some interesting and positive experiences regarding the design and implementation of these policies in some specific countries. For instance, I consider that it is interesting to note that in Chile and Uruguay, it is interesting to note that the existence of an umbrella program with the different coordinated pillars related to education, health, nutrition, employment, and housing. I think that it is interesting and important in order to have a more coherent system of social protection for children and for their families. In Uruguay, for instance, the implementation of the equity plan was accompanied by a tax and healthcare reforms based on a more comprehensive strategy for reducing structural poverty and inequality. So again, I think that this is a very interesting experience in order to reach a more comprehensive system. Another interesting point is in the unconditional cash transfer component of the cash transfers in the case of Chile, because it gives at least a minimum income to the most poorest families, which doesn't depend on the fulfillment of the conditionality. This is just a component of the cash transfers in the case of Chile. And finally, I would like to remark the interinstitutional coordination between different public agencies in the case of Uruguay and Chile. I think that it is important to consider this aspect because it's not so usual to observe this kind of effort in order to increase, to strengthening the institution capability in the institutional, interinstitutional coordination in these countries. Regarding the impact, it is interesting to know that there are a lot of common points between the Latin American experience and the South African case, because in general we can say that these programs are well targeted because they cover the most vulnerable families. They have, according to the empirical evidence, we can say that they have a positive impact on welfare, in particular extreme poverty, nutrition, education, in particular primary school attendance. The impact on secondary school attendance are in general lower than primary school attendance. I think that it is another interesting point. In fact, Brenton already mentioned the not conclusive result regarding the impact of the potential impact of these cash transfers on labor market. In particular, the discussion is about the potential disincentive to work. But I should say that according, again, the empirical evidence for the regions, in general, we can say that the result shows that this impact are null or very, very low. But I think that this is an interesting and an important point because there is a very important debate about this apparently negative impact of this cash transfer on labor market. In fact, it is interesting to ask Brenton about the positive, apparently positive impact of these cash transfers on the labor market, because it is interesting to know the way through which this positive impact could be appear. Another important point associated with these cash transfers that sometimes is not so analyzed in more detail is that this type of transfers guarantees, even when they are in general involved very low value of this benefit. But I think that the important point here is this type of transfers guarantees a stable amount of money that doesn't depend on macroeconomic or labor fluctuations. I think that this is a particularly important point associated with these cash transfers, considering that the poorest households face in general very unstable incomes and very unstable labor conditions. So I think that this guarantee can have not only short positive impact but also long-term positive impact. But at the same time, I should say that even when these CCTs have called the technical and political attention of the region, they account for only around 0.25% of the country's GDP. So this is one important aspect to consider when analyzing the potential impact of these cash transfers on welfare, and in particular on poverty and extreme poverty. So, considering this main aspect of the Latin American experiences, and in particular the comparison between these experiences with the case of South Africa, I think that, as already mentioned, two important debates associated with the current situation of these cash transfers, but also associated with the future, or the future of these cash transfers. One of these debates is a very well-known debate about regarding the universal versus means-tested approaches into poverty. And I think that we can observe advantages and disadvantages associated with these two different approaches into poverty. For instance, regarding means-tested programs, it is very well known that this is in general a costly strategy, because it is important in this case to identify correctly the beneficiaries of these cash transfers. So we needed to spend money in order to identify these beneficiaries, and reducing, of course, the amount of resources allocated for redistribution. In practice, in general, means-tested we can say that can never be perfect. So inclusion and exclusion errors are common in this kind of cash transfers. It is interesting to note that under this kind of means-tested programs, we can observe an stigma effect, because in order to qualify for benefit, applicants have to demonstrate that their total family incomes is below a threshold level. So this stigma can in turn discourage potential beneficiaries for applying for these cash transfers. Another critical issue has to do with the effect of this means testing on the behavior of a beneficiary. Again, here we can discuss about the particular effect of these means-tested programs on the behavior, for instance, of adults in the labor market, beneficiary adults in the labor market. So I think that the potential apparently negative effect of these cash transfers on the behavior in the labor market could be different if we have a means-tested program or we have a universal program. I think that there is an important space to evaluate the potential different effect according to specifically the type of cash transfer that we have. And finally, I think that one important aspect regarding this kind of, specifically this kind of means-tested program, is they could hamper the achievement of social integration and social cohesion. On the other hand, when considering universal programs, I think that, again, we can observe advantages and disadvantages. And one obvious disadvantage is that this scheme could imply has a high cost, or at least higher than in the case of means-tested program. And this is, I think that this is an important issue, especially considering the funding sources. If they are supported by internal tax funding, or if this kind of cash transfers are supported by, for instance, international funding, international cooperation. Of course, if the main aim is to reduce poverty and extreme poverty, they could be less effective than targeted programs. But on the other hand, maybe we can say that this kind of universal programs could have more social support, and since the benefits are not only for low-income families, but also for the middle or upper classes. But finally, I think that the decision, ultimately, even when we can consider advantages and disadvantages of these two different schemes, I think that the decision should be based on the conceptualization of social protection. This should be based on moral consideration and normative consideration. But even in the cases, for instance, in the case of Argentina or Uruguay, where we have these two pillars, contributory and non-contributory benefit, I think that it is important to increase the integration of these two pillars in order to reach all children. And the second final point is the role of the conditionalities. And here I have more questions than answers, but I think that this is a very interesting point because it's a big difference between the South African case and the Latin American cases. So I think that it is interesting to discuss with Brenton and the audience, of course, because I think that it is important to analyze different aspects associated with these conditionalities. For instance, the first question is, what are the objectives, the aims of these conditionalities? These objectives are more related to foster demand for social services or get social support. I think that in some cases the reasons behind these conditionalities are more associated with the second reason more than the first reason. The second point is if they really have an independent impact beyond the cash transfers. Here again, this is important to try to identify the difference between the impact, or to identify the independent impact of the conditionality beyond the impact of the cash transfer. It's very difficult to identify this independent role in Latin America because we have both aspects together, but some studies, for instance, for the case of Brazil, suggest that the factor that seems to be associated with the greater, for instance, school attendance and medical checkup for children is the increase in the total family income more than the conditionality itself. So this is one interesting point. And on the other hand, this suggests that not only this benefit could have an impact on household decisions, but any other kind of transfer, this cash transfer, could have this impact on families. So I think that this is important aspect to analyze in more detail. But the third point associated with the conditionalities, if the government are really able to monitor the fulfillment of this conditionality, and what about the administrative cost related to the enforcement of this conditionality that again could reduce the final resources for redistributions. And then I think that one of the most problematic points associated with the conditionalities is how to avoid the exclusion of the most vulnerable families that are not fulfill this conditionality. So ultimately, I think that it is important, at least in my opinion, I think that in the case of South Africa, it has the same approach regarding these conditionalities, is to change the perspective from one's perspective associated with the conditionality to the universal right for children to access and basic services. But understood as such, this requires guaranteed access to good quality social services. And finally, I would like to say that related with this kind of discussion about the conditionalities, I think that it is important to try to remove the social exclusion factor. I think that it is important. On the one hand, more integration about the different pillars of cash transfer for children. Again, in some countries in Latin America, we have different pillars associated with this childhood protection. So nowadays, I think that we needed to move forward towards a more integration about among these different pillars. But at the same time, as already mentioned by Brenton, we needed to reach greater integration with other programs trying to reduce the risk faced by families, this family with children. But considering the objective of reaching more social inclusion, I think that it is imperative to reduce the segmentation in the quality of the supply of basic services for targeted and non-targeted population. And another important point, especially associated with this kind of cash transfer, is the exit door of these cash transfers and the graduation rules. And the question here is if they are compatible with the aim of improvement the family's capability to remain out of poverty by their own means, if they are able to reduce the intergenerational transmission of poverty and inequality. So finally, I would like to remark that even when discussing the best design of these transfers and the discussion about the conditionalities and non-conditionalities, universalization or targeted programs, I think that these universalization strategies do not override the aim of creating more and better jobs in these countries, and in particular reducing informality and inequality, both in South Africa and in Latin America. The institutional design of this cash transfer is essential to turn such programs into permanent state policies. And finally, I consider that this cash transfer, decent social programs and for children has to be including in broader definition and implementation of a long-term economic development strategy. Thank you so much.
All right, this is again me, Alejandro, speaking. Thank you so much, Roxana. Again, a very, very rich presentation, and you highlighted a number of critical issues and pointed to actually some questions which can provide food for a discussion. We are running a bit late, but admittedly, we also started a bit late because we're trying to solve some technical glitches. So what I would like to do is to devote at least the next 15 minutes, go a little beyond 4:30, and devote at least 15 minutes to the questions that have come in from the audience. I have a few questions myself based on Roxana's presentation, but I think that I will keep them with me and go straight to the questions coming in from the audience. So we have a question for Brenton coming from Sweden, from Stefan Granlund, a PhD student in social protection, which asks, what is SASA and what are DSD and SASA doing in order to make sure that the relatively large number of children which are excluded from the CSG, who are eligible but are excluded according to SASA's annual performance plan, adding up to something to over 2 million children, what actions are being taken by DSD and SASA to make sure that those children actually come into the fold? And there is also a follow-up question from Stefan, who asks what the main challenges currently are for universalizing the CSG. Let me start with those two questions. Brenton, over to you.
Thanks, Alejandro. So thanks, Stephen. One of the difficult parts is when trying to estimate exclusion, it's not that easy. So for a long time, we've actually debated whether it's 2.3, or some reports saying 4 million, some reports saying a lot less. And there has been a study done by UNICEF and SASA which tries to delve a lot deeper into the reasons why there are some of these exclusions. I'm sure you can either download that off the SASA website or the UNICEF website. But there is currently a project running in SASA specifically for the 0 to 1 and those over 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 14 or over 12, 13, because we see a very huge drop off amongst our adolescents as well. Now the 0 to 1 is relatively quite easy, and it's been a huge drive. SASSA has been implementing what they call an iCrop program, where they take mobile vans, they go out into rural villages, and they try to get people registered as much as possible. We've also found, it's not just our rural villages, but also our urban centers, where there's a lot of confusion. People think that if they are working, they won't qualify for the child support grant, not realizing that if they're working but their incomes are still low, they will qualify. So a lot in our urban centers, we find that a lot of caregivers aren't coming forward. So a lot of marketing has been done as well in those areas and trying to get information out. So we have seen the numbers in the 0 to 1 category increasing quite a lot. The difficult part in the latter category is that we're seeing a lot of change amongst the adolescents in household structures, and because this is a grant that goes to the caregiver, as soon as the child leaves the house or moves out, those challenges begin. So the grant system in terms of policy is not necessarily designed that well for the older child, and we are beginning to look at work around catering more for youth, say 15 or 14 to 24 in that sense. In terms of universalization, your question on universalization, what are the obstacles? I think it's largely, it's quite a big reform, and so getting societal buy-in. So the big question often around universalization is why would you want to give a grant to wealthier people in society? But for us in South Africa, universalization is really about looking at the different sets of benefits that are available to different people in society. So if one really begins to unpack all the benefits one gets and not just look at the grant in isolation, you'll find that wealthy people do get benefits. They get benefits through rebates, through tax subsidies, through various items within that systems, and through other sorts of government programs that subsidize them, and often this leads to inequities. So at the moment, we're looking at the research in that area, beginning to unpack, the different benefits paid to different people, and the logic about unifying these benefits, not having a certain benefit for a certain group of people and another benefit for another group. That's a very brief answer. I'm not sure. I suppose for time we could probably take that into the online community to explore those two questions a bit more deeper. Alejandro?
Thank you, Brenton. A couple of questions on implementation. There is a question coming from Catalina, who asks how the child grant is implemented at the local level and what institutions are involved, and specifically if social welfare offices take a role in informing beneficiaries about the existence of social programs. There is one other question on implementation, but we'll go ahead with that one, please.
Okay, so as I presented earlier on, SASSA is now a national function. It's implemented through the South African Social Security Agency, which is a national organ. However, we still do work very well with our provinces. We have various provincial departments of social development, and there are strong linkages between SASSA and the provincial departments of social development. We also link well with our cooperative governance department, which is basically similar to a department of local development, where they have various community works. What do you call them? Community works. They're not employees, but they're people that work in communities, and community development practitioners as well. And all of them are pretty familiar with our various grants, and they do a lot of promotional work in communities. Our department also runs what we call a Mikonzo program, where all our staff, both at SASSA, at our development agencies, as well as in provinces, are required to spend at least 20% of their time within communities doing community work and making sure that the communities are Mikonza basically means expanding DSD's footprints in communities. So basically, our staff are in the performance agreements. Everyone is commissioned to go out into communities at least 20% of their time to do such kind of to do that type of work, including myself, all the way basically up to the DG, the Director General, is required to do work around that. So we do get quite a bit of local involvement, even at the political level. Our councillors, our ward councillors, we spend a lot of time with them as well, making sure everyone is very familiar with the social grant framework and other social development services. Okay, back to you, Alejandro.
Thank you, Brenton. You mentioned during the presentation the fact that there are certain, let's say, preconceptions or what could even be characterized as certain myths regarding abuse of the grant or perverse incentives. And we got a question actually regarding the possibility that caregivers may use the grant for their own purpose. So how can, what is the evidence and how can one ensure that the allowance actually will be used for the child in the household? And since we are on the topic of possible or alleged perverse incentives, maybe you, Brenton, and Roxana too, may want to address an issue that was raised by Roxana, but there was no time to expand on, which relates to the possible impact of these grants on, for example, on labor market participation and the whole issue of dependency. Over to you, Brenton.
Thanks, Alejandro. Okay, so in terms of perverse incentives, I think, you know, it's a very difficult one. You know, people are always going to think that caregivers are misusing the grant. Although, if you want, just looks at the slides that I've shown of how the grant is used, one can see that the bulk, in the vast majority of the cases, caregivers do use the grant for the benefit of the child. Yes, to some extent, the grant is also used for all members in the household, but that's just natural. You know, people don't, when they get money coming into their households, create separate wallets for that. The money comes into the households, and I think, you know, based on that principle of a primary caregiver, the person who is primarily responsible for the child, it is only natural that the person, which is in most cases women, are going to prioritize children. It's a natural instinct, I think, amongst most human beings. And in cases where that is happening, it's usually some kind of a social ill, and those are very limited cases and need to probably then be dealt with through your various social work services. But we don't necessarily see that that's something you can put into the framework of the grant to try and eliminate, because then you'll be overburdening the vast majority of your caregivers who are doing their very best with very little income to look after children. In terms of labor impacts, I mentioned earlier on that, you know, the evidence is not that conclusive. I'm just trying to see if I can show a slide. Can I still show slides? But there's quite a bit of research in South Africa, some saying that the grants are positive, it promotes labor participation, and there's more research suggesting that, but there are also some research reports that suggest that it doesn't. But I think there's no conclusive evidence, however, that has a negative impact on labor participation. There's more evidence that it does actually have a positive impact on labor participation. And a recent study from our Finance and Fiscal Commission also indicated recently that social grants also do play an important multiplier effect within local economies, and they've managed to quantify that it adds as much as 1% extra to our GDP on an annual basis.
Thank you, Brenton.
Yes.
Can I turn the floor to Roxana and see if she wants to add something on this?
No.
Roxana, would you like to add something on this issue?
Hello.
Okay, we seem to have lost Roxana. Are you there, Roxana? All right, we seem to have lost the connection with Roxana. So, and we need to be wrapping up anyway because we're running out of time. Just to give Roxana a chance to come back in, I want to take this opportunity to mention that to thank you, to thank the audience for the questions that you have sent. Of course, also to thank very much both speakers, Brenton and Roxana. I think that Roxana is back. Yeah.
Yes.
Maybe you can just.
I had a connection problem.
Okay, maybe just 2 minutes. One was on this question regarding work disincentives, possible disincentives to participation in the labor market. And another very interesting issue that you raised, and I know that we don't have much time for expanding, but particularly in the case of Argentina Child Allowance Program, you talked about an attempt at extending and integrating the pre-existing contributory family allowance benefits with a new non-contributory pillar of child benefits, saying that families in the informal economy and unemployed. Maybe if you can add a little bit to what extent what is being tried in Argentina, especially, and to some extent in other countries in the Southern Cone, differs from what is happening in other countries, including Latin America, in terms of having a non-contributory component, but which is not very well integrated with the existing social security system. Over to you.
Okay, thank you so much. Regarding the first point, the potential disincentive to work, as you already know, there is a very big debate about this potential disincentive, because the argument is when this family receive non-labor incomes and decide to reduce the participation in the labor market, because they already have money replacing this in kind of labor sources by non-labor income sources. But even when we can have a different argument regarding this kind of potential disincentive, the empirical evidence for Latin America, for Latin American countries, tell us that they are null in the empirical cases, or when they are not, they are positive. In general, the impact on the decisions regarding participation or not participation in the labor market in general is very low. So I think that we have to consider the evidence, the empirical evidence, in order to reflect about the theoretical argument, no? Because from the theoretical argument we can say that we could have a potential negative effect, but apparently, according to the evidence, it's not true. And the second point regarding this aspect, I should say that we needed to discuss in more detail why we consider negative impact on the labor market when some member of this family decide to reduce the participation in the labor market. I think that the discussion is we needed to consider, for instance, the conditions in the labor market and the member of the family who decide to be out of the labor force. So I think that the debate is more complex than just to see we can observe a reduction in the hours, the working hours, or the participation in the labor market. From the theoretical and from a more empirical perspective. And the second point, more related to the Argentinian case, I think that the Argentinian and Uruguayan cases, we can observe an important difference between the general Latin American experiences regarding, because they are more associated with these means-tested programs. In the case of Brazil or Mexico are examples of this kind of approaches. But in the case of Argentina, for instance, this is not the case, because in Argentina the decision was to increase the coverage of the already existing child allowances for formal employees. So the idea was to include the informal workers in this kind of cash transfers, and in fact the values of this benefit are the same in both pillars, contributory and non-contributory systems. So they are not based, these cash transfers, the Asignación Universal por Hijo, the universal child allowance in Argentina, is not based on the total family income. It's based on the condition of adults in the labor market, in order to give the same benefit to people working in the informal sector or people unemployed, the same benefit that already received the formal workers. So this is the idea behind the integration of these two pillars, but the point is how to reach a very high integration between these two pillars. So, but the way is different from the rest of Latin America. So the idea was to increase in this childhood protection based on the already existing allowances, formal allowances, child allowances for the formal sector. So the conception wasn't different. The case of Uruguay is similar to the case of Argentina.
All right, many thanks, Roxana. I think that really now we have come to the end of our time. It seems that for some reason I haven't been able to share my screen with the audience, in which case I deeply apologize for that. We have received a number of other questions, and I feel really bad about not being able to do justice to them, nor will I even try to kind of sum up what has been a couple of extremely rich presentations. But I think that a large number of issues have been raised. I personally find that having a presentation from a range of countries as part of the same webinar or main presentation, and then being able to reflect on the experience of that country in the light of the programs from other countries is a very enriching process, because it enables one to find some both the similarities and the contrasts, and provides a lot of food for thought. For those who have posed questions which have not we have not had the time to post them, let me assure you and invite all the participants and everybody who has registered for this webinar, invite you to go to socialprotection.org, explore the platform, discover its different features, and especially, as I mentioned before, there is an online child allowance community, and we intend to continue this discussion through that community of practice. So you can, those questions which have not been posted here and have not been addressed, we will do that in the next days and weeks. And any new questions or comments that you may wish to share with us, please feel free to do so, and we will come back to you with comments and answer. So at this point, all that remains is to thank Brenton van Friede very much for your participation. You're a very, very busy government official, and the presentation was excellent. Also, thank you to Roxana, to the entire audience, and a special thank you to Fabio, João, Mario, Raquel, and Alicia. I hope that I'm not forgetting anybody from the IPC IG. And let me invite you then again to visit the website, the platform, and to the next webinar, which is going to be announced soon. It's going to be in late September, and I understand that the focus is going to be on Uruguay. With that said, I wish you all the best, and hope that you have enjoyed the webinar as much as we did from this end. Thank you very much.